Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. As always, I want to begin with a personal appeal to you to let somebody know we're live right now. If you got the notice because you're a subscriber or you are a friend, either on Facebook or on YouTube or on Twitter or LinkedIn, thank you for being here. Thank you for being connected to us, but help us grow this engagement. We want to go and use YouTube as our principal monitoring of growth platform. So right now we've got around 300 subscribers. We want to get to 1,000, and I'm asking each of you personally to be a subscriber and to let your friends know that we have these rich conversations every day, The Conversation with Al McFarlane, and that we're trying to build community. And you can do that by going over to the YouTube Insight channel, subscribe, like, and share. I want to begin today's program, as I normally do, with a hot box topic, we call it. And in the news today, apparently the courts have decided that Matt Gaetz will not be charged for alleged criminal sexual activity. I'm going to try to pull that press release up because I want to start with that. Interested in your concerns, your feelings, your thoughts about how that is unveiling. So the headline in a story that's on NBC, the headline says DOJ tells Matt Gaetz that he won't be charged in a sex trafficking probe. That, according to Matt Gaetz's lawyers, the subhead says that prosecutors had spent months investigating allegations that Gaetz was part of a scheme that led to the sex trafficking of a 17-year-old girl. The story is written by Ryan Noble, Garrett Huska, Julia Ashley, Tom Winter, and Rebecca Shabbat, all of the NBC News organization. I'll read a couple of paragraphs. Again, interested in letting you know about it, but also what your thoughts are. Drop a note in the comments if you agree or have concern or angry or think this is the proper thing that our leadership should be doing. The story says the Justice Department is ending its sex trafficking investigation into Representative Matt Gaetz, Republican of Florida, without charging the congressman with any crimes. His attorneys and the congressional office told NBC News, open quote, "We've just spoken with the DOJ and have been informed that they have concluded their investigation into Congressman Gaetz and allegations related to sex trafficking and obstruction of justice, and they have determined not to bring any charges against him." Gaetz's attorneys, Mark Mukasey and Isabel Kirshner, said in a statement. Gaetz' office added, the Department of Justice has confirmed to Congressman Gaetz' attorneys that their investigation has concluded and that he will not be charged with any crimes. Background, prosecutors have spent months investigating Gaetz's personal conduct and specifically allegations that he was part of a scheme that led to the sex trafficking of a 17-year-old girl. At the core of their investigation was testimony from a former Gaetz associate, Joel Greenberg, who worked as a Florida tax collector. The DOJ itself has declined to comment on this. Well, let me know what you think. Let me know what you think. Send a comment here in the chat. Be interested in your point of view. Let me remind you again, tell your friends that we're live. We're having a great conversation today. We're going to be focusing on wealth creation, an important conversation. And it's one that you don't want to miss, that you should be a part of, and tell your friends to join us here as well. Pleased to welcome my guest today. My guest is Isaac Russell. He's the Director of Public Policy at the Center for Economic Inclusion. That group has been on board, been here at the conversation on several occasions. Always great information, inspired leadership, a visionary leadership in changing the narrative and the paradigm for how we grow and develop as a community, as a people, how we address the disparities by focusing on creating wealth in our community. Well, Isaac is the director of public policy at the Center for Economic Inclusion. He drives the center's policy efforts to create a more inclusive economy for people of color in Minnesota. He came to the center from the Minnesota State Senate, where he worked for 9 years as a legislative assistant to for the DFL caucus, including working for former Senate Minority Leader Susan Kent. He's also a former board member of the Highland District Council and is currently the chair of the Neighborhood Safety Community Council in St. Paul's Office of Neighborhood Safety. Brother Isaac, good to see you. Isaac Russell, welcome to the conversation with Al McFarlane. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to join you, Brother Al, and look forward to the conversation.
And I am as well, and let me just say, our mission here is simply for the two of us to connect and be as clear as we can, to raise as many questions as we can, to answer those questions, and to point to directions that the basis for the conversation is our shared belief in the timeliness and the appropriateness of our work, our endeavor to solve the problems, and that we believe we have the wherewithal, the energy, the genius, the minds, and now the commitment to organizing, to being with each other in ways that produces results that set a new future of opportunity and prosperity for our people. That's how I see it. How do you see it?
Well, I think you said it very well. I mean, I would say that, our state and our country is really reconciling with this racial past. And that has forced us to look inward and having some conversations that, quite frankly, for a lot of folks is uncomfortable. But these are necessary and very much needed conversations. So I think right now, especially, due to the trifecta, but also especially because we have an unprecedented amount of resources right now. I mean, $17.6 billion is an amount that I, as someone who's worked in politics now going on the 11th year, would never thought that we would see. So it's an historic opportunity to make substantial systemic investments that outlive the initial appropriation and actually begin to move the needle to close some of our racial gaps in Minnesota. So, I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity.
Well, you've written a piece that we're going to publish in Insight News in the next several days. Thank you for what you've written. The piece is entitled Our $65 Billion Opportunity, How Investments in Racial Equity and Inclusion Will Impact Communities and the Economy for the Better. And I love framing the opportunity this way so that it removes the fear that has driven, I think, part of the majority community to always distance itself from genuine, bona fide, change-oriented activity in our community, to question it and to abandon things that they feel threatened by. And you're saying that there really isn't a threat. There's an opportunity for everybody to gain. Why don't you go through the points in that? You talk about policy leadership. You talk about a new day has dawned, and you talk about the highlights of the Governor Walz's proposed $65 billion. Is it billion, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but in your article, you talk about a subset of that, a $65 million budget highlight. So go through this article for me and use this walk through the article to frame today's conversation, where we are in Minnesota, what the legislative opportunities are, and how organizations like the Center can crystallize pathways for achieving and exploiting the opportunity in a positive way.
No, absolutely. So from our vantage point, from the Center's vantage point, is that we look to build wealth, in Black and Indigenous, Latino and Asian communities. The reason we identify these communities, we feel it's very important to call them out by name. Who are the people that we're intending to help? And when we take a look at this budget, with $65 billion, such an unprecedented amount allows us to have some massive opportunities in terms of workforce development, in terms of efforts to build wealth for home ownership. It really runs the gamut of some of the opportunities that are available. Things like paid family and medical leave. We know that disproportionately workers of color have less access to paid family and medical leave, and we also understand that, for instance, Black women at a higher rate than their white female counterparts have to leave the workforce after initially having a child, right? It adds strains here. My own sister is someone who experienced having to take time off to have her child and had to have it uncompensated. So it's these sorts of things that begin to provide the assistance that is necessary now for people to stay in the workforce. But then also it's in terms of, for instance, looking at some of the workforce development that has been offered by Governor Walz. He is working with the Office of Higher Education. He's working with the Minnesota State system, for instance, on things around certifications. There is also efforts to expand the amount of money that is there and available for organizations that do this workforce development. He has set out a set of ambitious goals, as part of his workforce board just across the state, to develop this sort of talent that's necessary so that we can begin to shift people into these long-term careers and really build wealth. There's also efforts around home ownership. Housing is something that is, on the forefront of a lot of folks. As someone myself who was, housing insecure growing up, even experienced times of homelessness, the ripple effect that comes from the lack of housing just across both the family, and how that can transcend just that immediate generation and carry over to the next generation is profound. So we're seeing efforts within this budget to try to, for instance, do things around down payment assistance, which would help folks who are struggling to generate that sort of down payment necessary for them to become that first-time homeowner. This allows them to gain some money towards that. Very important things. There's other things in here that we very much like. This wasn't in the article, but this is something that I would really like to highlight. The governor is funding the contracts for home care workers. Now, these are a lot of SEIU employees. And what's very important about this is that disproportionately, we know that home care workers are people of color, disproportionately women, a lot of Black women. This sort of investment is transformational that is happening. I believe it's ultimately $500 million across a couple of fiscal years that would implement the contracts that have been negotiated on, and would allow us to begin to attract the sort of talent that we need to take care of our aging population, but then also make these careers appealing to people who want to take care of folks. This is to give them a pathway to gaining more income, and quite frankly, attracting people in what has been one of our highest growth industries, home healthcare. So I think there's a little bit of the benefits that we are seeing from our vantage points in this budget.
Let me make a comment there. First of all, though, that we had a note from Celeste. She asked, how do home ownership plans fit in? If you want to address that, home ownership in terms of wealth creation, wealth building, what are your thoughts first of all?
So for most families, what we've seen is that the biggest driver of wealth creation is their home, right? Americans, by and large, are not the greatest of savers, right? And actually, if you compare us to a lot of folks in Europe, our rate of savings is down. So what is one of the ways that we can have people sort of mimic what that savings would be? Building equity in their home. But we have to make sure that this is something that remains at the forefront. We have a lot of folks who are cost burdened in terms of their rent, which is a very real situation that we have to address. But we also need to take a look at how we begin to transition people who want to transition out of that position as a renter into a homeowner. So things like the down payment assistance is necessary because, again, for most Americans, is that wealth generating asset is most likely going to be their home, and if they're able to pay that off, it'll be a place in which they can reside, as they age into retirement.
My other comment before I made the mention of Celeste's question was in reference to your statement about the growing home healthcare business, and I think that's a wonderful thing, and it's an opportunity. And here's why. I think that for the developing of Daniel Moynihan's analysis of the defunct Black family with men out of the house and women running the house and having to need help from the government, the creation of the welfare class, there was the idea that um, that in order to get the assistance, families could not have uh, a unemployed or unengaged man in the house. And that really fueled the separation of families, where men, in order to make sure their families could survive, had to absent themselves in order to comply with the rules.
Right.
And those rules created a situation where, I'd say dozens, many white people got jobs managing Black people's poverty.
Yes.
I have often said, I call this an Al McFarlane-ism. We get the misery, they get the money. Our misery becomes a business for them. And they bring the experts and the analysts and the researchers and the gatekeepers and the program managers out of their communities to oversee how we are doing, but they do not really support, from my point of view, substantive transformational change that addresses the root problems, that allows solutions and change to grow and occur.
Mhm.
If they had, we wouldn't have the disparities. We have to measure what the performance has been, and everybody has to agree by the analytics available now that the disparities have simply increased, and it's structural. So they can no longer say it's our problem, or just the problem of Black people. It's the problem of an entire set of arrangements, an economy, a system that disadvantages us in a structural way and advantages them in a structural way. What your argument is, in part, is that there's a solution that doesn't make them have to feel they have to lose anything. That if we solve the root inequity and lack of access to opportunity and blocks to opportunity in our community, everybody's going to gain, everybody's going to do well and do better. And so that led to the point I'm making, things like home health care. If we could train a gazillion Black people to provide expert, certified, quality care to the elderly, to the shut-in, to the sick, to the infirmed, they would have livable wages serving each other. And what if we had a system for, I say mental health is a big issue right now, right? What if we had 30, 40 more, times more professionals in the mental health and therapy arena than we have now? People professional, getting paid, and serving neighbors, family, and friends. So I think that's transformational. And your comments made me think of that. I wanted to share it.
No, I mean, this is a great opportunity. And so I think you bring up something that's very important. And from a public policy perspective, it's something that has not really been acknowledged, except for, maybe by academics who are writing books, and been folks like you, right? People who have that knowledge that come from community, right? When we take a look at, for instance, managing the poor, right? It's really been a thing about managing the poor, but then also disciplining the poor. There was a point in time in which Black people were not allowed to be on AFDC. My father originally hails from Omaha, and he remembers when his mother originally went in because she was eligible for the program on paper, but was told, in not so many kind words, to get her Black self out of there. It wasn't for her. But when you began to see those laws in the 1960s that said, well, these people are eligible, so therefore apply, and you saw people of color, you saw Black people accessing the benefits that they're eligible for, now it becomes a problem that you have to manage, right? And it's not just a poor white problem. Now it's Black people that you have to manage. But then the conversation becomes, and you saw this in the 1990s, it becomes, how do you discipline Black people? The narrative switches from helping families to, well, we need to make sure we get rid of this generational poverty. We need to make sure that people shift off of this. So here comes some work requirements. We're going to shift you off. And regardless of whether or not that income that you are moving to when you leave, that the public assistance is enough for you to survive, that's your issue. You're going to have to figure that out. So I think now when we begin to conceptualize the challenges and these inequities, these racial inequities that our state faces as opportunities for investments, then people begin to reorient that conversation away from you're taking from some to give to others. Instead, what we're doing is we are adding value to the economy. We are uplifting people who historically have not experienced that. And what happens when you have those programs at work? You know, I had a white grandfather who took the GI Bill, government funded, went and bought a home in the suburbs, being built at the time, since he was after World War II, by the government. And that historic investment in him allowed for, when my family was struggling, to lift me up and to make sure that I had the opportunities like Pell Grants, things like that, and I went to school. But the thing is that it shouldn't have to rely on me getting lucky who my grandparents are. It should be the state investing in people and seeing this as not just a Black problem to be managed, but as a problem of Minnesotans, and how do we make sure that everyone benefits from this economy? That is a productive conversation that I think people are having, and it needs to continue.
We used the number, and you used it in your article, about the $60 billion opportunity, $65 billion. Explain that. That's the state proposed budget for the year, $65 billion. Explain that.
So the $65 billion is what Governor Walz has recommended for his budget, so his portion. If you take a look at the federal funds that the state of Minnesota receives, the actual amount of programs and revenue that goes to pay for all that is well over $100 billion. We get things such as, you know, obviously block grants and all that other stuff, county, but his is at $65 billion for his proposed budget.
And so the economy of the state, or the revenue of the state, what's the number? What's the gross output, I guess the right gross GDP of the state of Minnesota? What is our government taking in and spending in the course of a year? Do you have that number? I know this is not.
My apologies. I do not have that number offhand. But if he's proposing 65, and the fact that the state of Minnesota and all states cannot run a fiscal deficit, we're constitutionally and statutorily not allowed to do that, then the revenues, you know, and including, so his budget does include obviously the surplus. But if you were to walk all that back, I would say the revenues are less than the 65, but forgive me, I don't have that number on me.
Okay, great. Now, the question comes up because it's nice to be able to put it in context to see what the overall pie is like. Well, you know, you guys over at the Center for Economic Inclusion have also given the surplus of $17.5 billion, proposed a $10 million state appropriation that you say can help close Minnesota's racial gap. And there's a story in the Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal where on February 9th, Keith Schubert, a reporter, is writing about your organization. He says, a Twin Cities organization dedicated to closing Minnesota's racial wealth gap is asking the Minnesota legislature for $10 million to create more equitable economies. The St. Paul-based Center for Economic Inclusion, which is asking for the appropriations, that the money would help create jobs and grow businesses through equitable means. He goes on to say that your organization states that history proves that when racial equity and economic inclusion are not prioritized in policymaking, the result is often inequitable policies, loss in economic growth, and harmful impacts to Black, Indigenous, Latino, and Asian communities that can ripple for generations. And that statement came out of a press release your organization released. Finally, I'll say that according to the House File 306, which is authored by Representative Ruth Richardson, DFLer of Mendota Heights, and Representative Athena Hollins, who's a DFLer from St. Paul, the $10 million appropriation in fiscal year 2024 would come from the general fund and flow through the Department of Employment and Economic Development to the Center for Economic Inclusion for strategic data-informed investments in job creation strategies that respond to the needs of underserved populations statewide. Well, that's I'll stop there, and you can unpack that, explain what that means. It gives me a chance to have you talk about the nature of the center, the role of the center, the vision of the center. So I'm going to let you go ahead and share.
Most certainly. So the first thing that that I will note is that we understand that in terms of closing our racial gaps, it's not just the center that can do this. Is we need partnership both with state agencies, with policymakers, but then also with a whole host of folks that make up the ecosystem of people who have this mission towards equity, making our racial equity gaps smaller, being more inclusive. So this appropriation would go to fund a lot of the work that the center does. So I should probably say something about what the center actually does. Yes. So the majority of the work that we do, or a lot of the work that we do, is around sort of equity consulting. So we work with a lot of companies, or we work with local units of government who come in and they say, hey, we have an equity-oriented goal or effort that we would like you to lead. We gauge where they're at. We use some bespoke tools, anti-racist frameworks, some things that we've created to help us measure both where our companies and local units of government at in terms of equity. Are they ready for this work? And then attempt to set them up for success by creating a bespoke project that meets their goals. We've worked with folks ranging from, St. Louis County to Greater St. Cloud, Ramsey County, and we also worked with the Metropolitan Council, Xcel Energy. So it's a varied list of folks. We also have several things that we offer in terms of our Vanguard Accelerator. Our Vanguard Accelerator program is really an effort to allow businesses to go to scale in industries that we identify that are for growth, and trying to reach a network of folks who oftentimes have very difficult time navigating access to traditional lending sources. So we have our business accelerator that allows them to be applicable for grants or technical assistance. But we also have our Project Vanguard that allows us to make grants available, forgivable loans available for folks who want to do things such as land acquisition. We have several partners that we're working on with this, including Founders First and NEO. So this is really an effort in which we try to get dollars out of our coffers and to the entrepreneurs. And recently we've awarded $450,000 to some entrepreneurs, and this work has been funded, in part by JP Morgan with a $5 million appropriation from them. But we're seeking, obviously, some funds from the state that allows us to really bring this up to scale and work towards our stated goal of trying to we're trying to get as much money as we can out to folks.
Well, one thing in the article, I just looked at it. It says, the 10 million you're looking for from the state is, quote, just a start to close what you all estimate is the $287 billion cost of racism in Minnesota. Can you unpack that? What does that mean? How do you come up with that number? And I think it's wonderful that you're naming the problem and naming it in a way that we can measure the solution, as opposed to looking at as something that's impossible, too big, intractable, and therefore not worth the investment of energy, time, and of money. And therefore it remains, and we keep losing. But talk about that $287 billion cost of racism in Minnesota.
So when we take a look at what are the costs of racism, in part is we're saying that, for instance, when you don't allow, for instance, unpaid family and medical leave, Black women to have the same access as their white counterparts, that comes at a loss of wages because they have to exit the market. So what it is when we take a look at that is, when we look at the lack of access to things such as healthcare, lack of access to things as education, all of these factors lead to what we call this lost wages, things that is a bit of a counterfactual, right? Because you're saying, if we did have this, this is what we feel we could generate. And we think it's important to put a dollar figure on this because it begins to name the problem, but it also says to you, resources have to be allocated. It allows us to close this. And it also reveals the systemic nature of the challenge, right? You do not generate over 280, as the number you quoted. You do not generate that by not having its systemic challenges in the way, so that solutions have to be systemic. And this is our effort to both name what the issue is, but then also begin to point the finger at these are the resources that we need.
One of the tools you all are using is called you call it REIN. It stands for Racial Equity Impact Notes. I'm going to ask you to
Yes.
define that and to talk about how this tool has been developed, how you're using it, and what it can do to help both clarify and focus attention on the solutions that must be created.
So racial equity impact notes is really something that has kind of been around and in the ether for a few years. But what we did is we wanted to provide a little more teeth to it. So this is something that had originally been introduced as a concept a few years back by former Senator Jeff Hayden. So in the 2021 session, there was a bill that was originally introduced, and it had two portions to it. It had a working group portion that would figure out how these would operate, and then an implementation date.
Mm-hmm.
That ultimately did pass the House, but it did not come into law. Seeing the writing on the wall, we figured that, hey, what if we assembled the working group? What if we went to folks who are like-minded in the shared mission of equity and tried to craft a working group that would build what these look like? And so I came in actually into my position during the middle of this working group. And what we did is we did a survey of the different type of equity notes that exist across the country. Oftentimes what we were seeing is that they were oriented more towards criminal justice, basically saying that, you know, if we're passing or a potential piece of legislation oriented towards criminal justice, what are the folks that are going to be impacted by this? And we ended up settling on a couple of notes that we thought were very good, one from Colorado and one from Washington, D.C. We put those together, did a bit of a trial run with two bills that had passed so we could generate some data so we could take a look at that, because one of the important things for the center is that we are data informed, right? Because we understand, again, the systemic nature of the challenges. From there, we evaluated the results. And since then, we have been working with policymakers to get this bill drafted, which we do have draft language as it exists right now. And really what we're attempting to do is to say, hey, when you have a piece of potential legislation, and we want to assess what are the racial equity impacts of this, we want to generate a note in which the state basically says, all right, let's do some assessments on the impact. Who are the people that are going to be impacted by it? What are the sort of metrics that we're going to use? We've developed some metrics, such as things around wealth building, income, or expenses. What does that look like for the populations we are targeting? And the idea is that if we are able to provide during session data for policymakers to be better informed about the pieces of legislation that they are advocating for, or perhaps not advocating for, that we would give them insights on how to better craft systemic and racially equitable solutions, for Minnesotans.
That's awesome. You know, it's important because I think it moves the quote unquote movement to a different level. It makes our demand and our requirement of ourselves and society based on data and research and analysis, and it uses those tools to our advantage. These are tools that have been used to our disadvantage. We've been the objects of study for a long time. In our experiences, they would do the research and do the study, write the papers, put them on the shelf, and they'd come and study again when another crisis emerged that required looking at the same problem. But typically, the studying did not lead to substantial transformative change in communities, certainly did not lead to ownership of the data and the capacity, the need to provide our own analysis, our interpretation of the meaning of the data, and how we use the data to move our community towards a freedom that we think really actually means the salvation of the entire nation, when our people become genuinely free and genuinely enabled to be our authentic selves in community. We think that's going to be a net plus for everybody. So research-driven data-driven decision making, and your organization through this system and process elevates our capacity to both note and analyze and project where we have to go, what the failings have been, and what the solutions must be to address the specific particulars. It takes it out of the cloudy, the fuzzy, the oh, I think, oh, my gut is, but nothing ever happens. And it moves it into this is on paper, it's black and white, and it's item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's A, B, C, D, E. And if we are genuinely concerned about changing, here's how we have to measure the change. I think that's a wonderful thing. I think that's the future for our people to use data. And so, you know, the work of the center, I'm looking at a document now on your center's working to make the racial equity impact notes system a reality. Um, how much you mentioned it, but tell me more about how you actually personally were invested in bringing this to the forefront at the organization.
So when I came in, we had already assembled the working group and we were already working on it. From my vantage point and being the director of public policy, I drive the creation of our policy agenda. So we had brought in an outside researcher to help facilitate that working group. So what it really was is assisting other folks leading on that working group. Hey, what is it where we're going? How do we craft something that is feasibly can be done in a certain amount of time during the legislative session, but also something that provides some real data, right? Something that's greater than just U.S. Census data, right? You can go look that up yourself, right? So something that's a little bit more substantive. And so currently, as it is right now, I work with our lobbyists at Frederickson and Byron to get the language drafted, to meet with legislators, but then also to build awareness by speaking just to folks such as yourself about what this tool is and how this can have an impact. Because one of the most important things when it comes to working with policymakers is they have to see that there is support for things in the community. They have to see that not just the person who's coming to them asking them, hey, this is a great idea, you should do this. They have to know that someone cares about doing this stuff, and not just in general cares about equity, but someone that actually cares about the specific thing that you're doing, which is what we hope we're generating. But my role is really just to work with our lobbyists to try to get this across the line.
Tell me about your own personal story. Again, I am intrigued that you talked about your dad and your mom. And I often try to, I think, humanize these difficult questions that we all are grappling with. And you do that by getting into the application of both the problem and the solution in recognizable people's lives, and that's why I'm glad you talked about your own personal story. I want to know more about you. I'm impressed that you had the career of 9 years at the legislature and the work you're doing in community. How did you come to this work?
So maybe a little bit about myself. Look, we won't go back and cover all 39 years, but
we might. Okay.
So I'm originally from St. Paul. Lived over by the cathedral, but my family, we faced a lot of challenges. Throughout my younger years, is that my mom for most of that time was a single mother with my sister and my brother. Feel sorry for my mom because my sister's 10.5 months younger than me and my brother's 2 years, so she had us all right in a row. So as one enters the stage, the other one's exiting, but very stressful. But she had gone to school to be a nurse, and this was before nurses were paid what they're paid now. Not to say that they're living high on the hog, but nonetheless it was just a different environment. And with 3 kids, that was something that we struggled with. So we had been on a lot of these benefit programs, right? So from a very early age, remember the food stamps, the funny money, going to the store with that. We had been in Section 8 as one of these sort of ironies in life, I guess. For a period of time, we lived with my father, and it was in a homeless shelter across the street from where I work right now. So we're Center for Economic Inclusion is in the Osborne building on Wabasha, and I was in a homeless shelter just across from Victory Ramp. Every day I walk out and I see that entrance.
How old were you at that time?
I was 13, and I remember it very well because Michael Jordan came back in '95. So,
okay.
But it's a great reminder when I walk out Victory Ramp where I park, contract parking across the place from where I was waiting for my Section 8 voucher to move into affordable housing. And for me, we spent a little bit of time in Arizona, and unfortunately, there was a landlord who had took advantage of our family, and we were just not able to recover. And living in a hotel that was not healthy, to say the least, roach infested, these sorts of things. So my grandparents that I had mentioned before said, and this is where that generational investments in people come in. They said, come up, live with us, and we'll help you. They were not rich by any stretch of the imagination, but it was stability in my life. And it was living in a house that was a home instead of living in a place that you're not going to be in X amount of months. And that stability was foundational. I was going to school.
And your grandparents are white?
They were white. Well, actually, interestingly enough, is my grandmother is actually from a native village in northern Michigan. She's an elder in the Ottawa tribe, and actually so is my mother. And my grandfather was white. But that, him being white and being able to take advantage of the opportunities that are given to him, he worked hard, absolutely. But the difference was, if you were a black man in 1945 and you came back from the war fighting for European freedom, you took your GI Bill, and you can't get into the white schools. My grandfather went to Michigan State. HBCUs are full. So what do? Right? That is that systemic obstacles due to systemic racism that they face. My grandfather worked hard, but didn't have to face that. And look what it did for us. It provided us that stability, right? I'm looking over and I'm seeing, my friend's parents at a football game, right? You better behave because we're going to go tell your mom, which of course I behaved. It was my brother and sister. But that was very formative for me, so I ended up going to Century, getting my AA there when I worked on a shipping dock, was a project manager at an industrial flooring company, and got my a double major in poli-sci and history when I was working through there. And, I volunteered on a campaign, just volunteered on a campaign. Former Senator Jim Metzen, unfortunately, is no longer with us. And he gave me an opportunity. He said, well, we're not sure if your resume is qualified, but we'll give you a shot. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Jim, but I got in, and he gave me that opportunity. And that was really how I got into this world of public service. It's something that I've always been interested in. But, so I spent 9 years at the state legislature, and, I was working for Senator Susan Kent, and, she, had been through a lot as leader, and she, her mother was very sick, and her husband was going to retirement. She said, you know what, I want to be with my husband. I want to take care of my mom. And she made a decision not to run for re-election. And I figured it's a good time to tip on out the door and look for other opportunities. And that's how I ended up here.
We had a question from a person who's a regular viewer. We thank him for watching and monitoring the program. Mike V. Mike V, thank you so much for whenever you hear and letting people know about us. Your question is on the screen here. You're asking, since Black people make up 9% of the tech industry, can you speak, Isaac, to any data that will create impact to drive DEI in the emerging technology industry that supports Black folks? Any thoughts on that?
So I would say, just for one thing, for the Center for Economic Inclusion, we don't do traditional DEI work. How do you make your workplace, how do you make your leadership, your hiring, your procurement, your whatnot more inclusive based upon your own stated goals? I would say, and one of the things that has been done, for instance, at the state level, is they have the angel investor tax credit, right? And that's really oriented towards these startup businesses. There has been a bit of a struggle because there's a certain portion of those funds that are held over for investments, in part into businesses of color, but it oftentimes does not it does not get to where it needs to go. So from our vantage point, that would obviously, the state would, how do you better target it? How do you make sure that you're accessing these potential businesses to give them the startup that's necessary on that angel tax credit? From our vantage point, also with project with our Project Vanguard, so our Vanguard Accelerator, that would, if someone had startup capital and it was in the tech industry, it would provide that those resources available to them. But I think that's the best insights that I can give you on that question.
Okay, well, great. Thank you. Thank you. So let's continue talking about you again, and how you integrate your vision and your experience into the assignment that you have at the center. I think that's just a wonderful story that you've outlined, and you've, in a sense, personalized the drive that you're bringing, kind of the reason for it, and the expectations that your experience place on you to both pursue and to be effective and to connect. And the beauty of what I'm hearing from you, Brother Isaac, is that you've been able to connect inside of an organization of like-minded people, probably stories, variations on the theme, but no exact same story, but all of us have experiences that are both unique to us and dissimilar at the same time. And I'm imagining, because I know Tawana, she's got a great story, and I've read the bios of some of your colleagues. You have a phenomenal team of people that have experienced knowledge, specific knowledge and capabilities, and to have an opportunity to be together and to think together, and then
So I'm having a hard time. I cannot hear you right now. I'm not sure what that is.
Oh,
Still can't hear you. I did hear someone else. Okay, it said, I think Yasmin said the audio went out.
Okay, so it looks like we are having a little bit of technical difficulties. Miss Al will be joining us in a few moments. So let's actually kind of continue with that conversation. So I believe that Miss Al was going to really want to hear about the team that is surrounding in the economic inclusion, and just talking about how you guys are coming together to really address the importance of racial and income inequalities. So why don't you share with us about the team, and then also share with us about, I know various states, especially for REIN, do impact the
assessments.
Assessments to help with racial legislation. So why don't you just tell me a little bit about that?
So, I mean, I'll say about our team is fantastic. I mean, our team's bad, right? It's, all props to our team. We've been adding so many talented people. And for me, myself, as someone this is now my 11th year in policy, I'm connecting with folks who are teaching me so much about policy. Their experience is great. We have other folks just, who come from so many different industries, but they're committed to equity. They're committed to racial inclusion. And what they do is they bring their vantage point, right, where they're starting from, and they bring it into this mission, because they understand that in order to actually close these gaps, we're going to have to tackle it from multiple angles, right?
I'm not sure. Can you hear me now?
I can't hear you now.
Okay, great. I wasn't sure that my fix worked, but okay, keep talking about your team. Your team is fun. And thank you, Yasmin, for jumping in. That's why I'm lucky to have brilliant people like Yasmin around me to make this thing happen and to just pick it up and run with it. So, but it means the world. And like I said, when I read the bios, and we will run stories on new hires at the center, because we think it's important to elevate you and to elevate the team members, elevate the work. Our objective is to create new conversations among our people, conversations that are infused with the idea of our capability, of our capacity, of our commitment to success, and even of redefining what success is, because it may be different for us than it is for other people, but coming up with recognizing what defining reality means and coming up with the idea that we have a duty.
I think the audio went out again.
Okay, so it looks like we have audio issues again. So I apologize, guys, in advance. Mr. Al is going to hop back off and then come back on, and hopefully everything will be fixed. But in the meantime, Isaac, I think that you understand what the direction that Mr. Al was going. And so, share what you wanted to share.
No, most certainly. So I would say, again, our team is fantastic, and they come from so many different places, so many different sectors, right? There's people who were, for instance, doing business or economic development. They were doing it in Southeast Asia, and now they're here and they're working on racial equity in Minnesota. We have folks who are doing business development, workforce development, people who are doing workforce development, in North Minneapolis, people who are doing it across the state, people doing economic development from St. Paul, myself working with policymakers, just up at the Capitol. But we understand you have to have a systemic solution that brings in people from so many different angles so that you can see things that you don't see, right? There's a lot that I don't see on how to close these gaps. I'm not a business person, right? So I sit at the feet of our folks who have that sort of expertise. But my area that I come in is to work on that sort of policy. And so when we, take a look at some of the solutions that we've oriented, that is in part why we're doing the racial equity impact notes, right? Because we've seen just across the country attempts to implement this. But how can we do this in a way that actually moves the needle in Minnesota? That's why the Washington, D.C. model, which is one of the ones that we borrow from, is actually very important, because it actually attempts to generate a little more insight. Good to see you back, Brother Al. A little more insight about how you would actually produce one of these notes, and then how you could actually close some of these gaps, right? And these sorts of efforts, just would not be possible without the folks that we have here at the center. And again, they're all bringing their own individual expertise. They all have their own story. We have so many, women of color. We have people who are white, who are dedicated, which is something that is absolutely essential and necessary. Is white people having tough conversations with people who assume that just because someone that looks like yourself, Al, or me are not in the room, that they think that they can say certain things.
Mm-hmm.
It's making sure that you have people who are saying, you know what, I don't think so. But I think what is very important, and I think that's something that the center offers, is that we have folks who hey, we have to deliver results for people, right? And not only do we have to deliver results, is that we understand, because the positions that we're at, various stages in our career, that you can't die on every hill. You have to make sure that when you're going out there and you're fighting, you still got to deliver something to people. So that's right. One of the foundational things for me when I'm working with policymakers. It's one of the foundational things for me. I'm running for city council in St. Paul. It's one of the foundational things for that, is that when I'm doing something, is what I'm doing going to A, move the needle on what I'm trying to do, but then B, when I go to sleep at night, do I think I'm doing the right thing? Right. And I know that this is not about me. This is not about the center name and headlights or anything like that. This is about delivering to folks. And as you keep people at the center of what your efforts are, well, then you're going to find some allies. You're going to have some tough conversations, but you're going to begin to move forward. And that's essential.
I think what you have to discover, are you hearing me now? Hearing me okay now?
Yes, sir.
Good. I hope it sticks this time. What you have to discover too, and I'll ask you to address this, Isaac, is that there's plenty of work, a lot of work, and all of us have places we can work and work best. Okay. And a criticism that we have to offer ourselves is that too often in the past we've been positioned to work at cross purposes to each other. And so someone would say, oh, what the center is doing, that's what somebody else is doing, or that's what someone else is doing. And because one person is operating in that arena, another person shouldn't, another shouldn't. But the reality is that we need everybody to do all they can all the time, wherever they can do it. And if there is this notion of competition, it shouldn't be scrapping for limited funds. It should be competing to see who can best serve and best solve, right?
Yes.
And the nature of that competition ought to be at its very core a spirit of improving oneself and each other in the community. And that's a healthy competition, but it's not the kind of competition we've been forced to play in, which encourages us to devalue each other and to destroy each other for somebody else's benefit. That story comes out of, I think, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. There's a scene of brothers being put into a boxing ring for the enjoyment of some Southern people. And how do we keep our problem solving away from being used as humor and fun for other people? That reminds me of an interview with Dr. McFarlane a few days ago, where we talked about the Clotilda and Africa Town, and that you might know the story of the last ship that was built to import slaves that pulled into Birmingham. And the impetus of that movement was not the necessity of people to be enslaved, but a bet. I bet you I can do this. And so that dehumanizes us. And so I'm glad to see that you all are operating. I ask you, how do you operate in a way that guards against that invitation to be in competition in a negative way?
Right. I mean, so we always have to remember we cannot be prone to a myopic view of the world, right? A parochial sense of self, right? We don't exist in the vacuum. There is plenty within the realm of closing our racial gaps that requires all hands on deck, right? And that does not mean that, folks are like, well, we're also going for that grant too, right? I'll tell you what, if you get it, congratulations to you. And I hope you close those gaps, right? We're going to go for the next one, and we're going to work hard to close those gaps. And it's that healthy competition that says, I bet you I close that gap better. I bet you I can close more, right? And have someone else saying, oh, I could, let's do all that. Because that is that healthy competition that says, I see you, do that good work. I want you to succeed, because when you succeed, the rest of us succeed, right? It's let's socialize the successes, right? Let's not just socialize the cost of inequities or racial inequities in our state. Let's socialize the benefits of it. And let's understand that when we all succeed, right? We always hear that, right? Wellstone, we all do better when we all do better. Well, now it's the time to make sure we all do better. And then including Black people, including people of color, we all do better. I think of James Baldwin when he talks about achieving our country. That's a process that will never be completed. And it should not be completed, because we're facing historical challenges that manifest themselves in new ways. And we're going to have to be innovative both today and tomorrow on how we close these gaps. There will always be there. There will always be the attempt of folks to divide, crabs in a barrel, right? That sort of thing. But that's not how we do. That is not how we'll be successful. You celebrate the successes of all, and you put your nose to the grindstone. And at the end of the day, at the end of my life, hopefully I can look back and someone says, you helped.
That'll have to be the mic drop. Thank you so much, Isaac. Great conversation, continued success, and we'll talk again.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate it.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. We'll see you tomorrow.